back to order. Bonjour et bienvenue tout le monde.
Good morning or good afternoon to you all.
Committee on National Defense, which started on Friday, May the 21st, 2021. Please, if interpretation is lost, please let me know immediately so we can ensure that everyone has an opportunity to fully participate in the proceedings. When speaking, as always, I'm as much saying that to myself as anyone else. Please speak slowly and clearly, and when you're not speaking, your mic should be on mute. All right. With regard to a speaking list, the clerk and I will do our best we can to maintain a consolidated order of speaking for all members, whether they're participating virtually or in person. So we are resuming debate on Mr. Bagnall's amendment to Mr. Bazan's motion, and Mr. Spengeman had the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and good afternoon, colleagues. Let me return in a moment to where I left off when we suspended last time, but just to reorient members and our audience, we had since the 21st of March, I believe, is when this meeting first started. We have had fulsome interventions on a number of key components to our study, and in the interpretation of colleagues on the Liberal side, there's two fundamental elements to the work that's ahead of that this committee is charged with. One is the accountability around the instances involving the former chiefs of defense staff, and most notably the former chief of defense staff, Jonathan Vance, who was appointed in 2015, and along the way was reported to have made the statement that he owns the Canadian Forces National Investigative Service, and is subject to complaints, and his tenure continued into the current government. That's one fundamental element of the committee's work in our interpretation. The second is how to change the culture of the Canadian Forces, how to make recommendations to get us into a space where those kinds of instances, these instances of sexual misconduct will no longer happen. Equal importance attached, in my view, to both of these components. We've highlighted the importance, in fact, the primary importance of the testimony of victims through recent interventions by my colleagues, for which I thank them. We've also highlighted the importance of expert testimony and testimony from elected officials, including the Minister of National Defense, who testified to this committee for 6 hours, with the conclusion that the time for patience is over and that we need a complete and total culture change, and he has invited recommendations and ideas for solutions. And also officials, very senior officials in the Privy Council office and the Prime Minister's office. And in addition to that, and academic experts having testified to us, we have also looked at experiences in other jurisdictions, notably in some cases, jurisdictions with whom we work very closely because they are either NATO allies or Five Eyes allies or armies, armed forces with whom we operate in various multilateral and international settings. And these experiences I've put to the committee are important for a number of reasons, and one of them is the systematicity of the issue that we're facing, which extends outside of the borders of Canada. Secondly, that these experiences, to the extent that they've resulted in reports and actually follow-up inquiries and reviews of initiatives that have been undertaken to probe their effectiveness, are illustrative of the kind of thinking that this committee should engage in and use its parliamentary mandate and authorities and energies for. And lastly, that the actual solutions proposed in other places could actually be extremely relevant to the Canadian solutions that we are charged with exploring. In several cases, Madam Chair, as members have heard, there have been references to the Canadian initiatives, most notably the Deschamps report in 2015. What's interesting when we look at these comparative experiences, and I spent about an afternoon and located a good half dozen of them, and I've presented one in full, which is the UK case, and I was in the midst of introducing a second one, the experience of New Zealand. What's interesting is that the work started round about the same time of the Deschamps report in the mid 20-teens, so 2014, 2015. And a good portion of these inquiries were actually concluded, and then in some cases actually followed up last year in 2020. I wanted to draw, just before I get back to the case of New Zealand, I wanted to draw members' attention briefly to an article on Poland. Poland is a NATO ally of ours, and this article goes back to October 2020. And I've said to members, when I talk about experiences elsewhere and the kinds of recommendations that other jurisdictions have made, it often seems bureaucratic. It seems mundane in a way because the language does not capture the emotion and the testimony and the injuries, the harm that was inflicted on women, mostly in those other jurisdictions who have served or who are serving. And briefly, then the experience from Poland is illustrative of the kinds of emotions that we've seen here through victims who've had the courage to come forward, and discussions we've had with colleagues also at other committees, not just ours. This particular article notes it's a Polish English language Polish publication in a high-profile case from 2017. Former military gendarmerie officer Karolina Marchlewska accused a fellow soldier of sending her obscene text messages and a senior officer of groping her. When Marchlewska told a superior, he responded by asking her questions about her private life. The internal investigation into these allegations was later discontinued, and Marchlewska herself lost her job. I'm being made guilty, a perpetrator, Marchlewska told the media outlet. There was no help either from the Defense Ministry or from the command of the military gendarmerie. Captain Bożena Subzinska, a former Defense Ministry representative for women in the military service, told the media outlet that, quote, the military is unable to cope with violence against women. Women do not report cases to military law enforcement agencies because they're afraid of repercussions, stigmatization, and harassment, she said. Even when they do make reports, they often, under pressure, withdraw cases at the prosecution stage. Worse still, Subzinska added, the method of solving the problem is simply to remove the women who report harassment from the ranks of the military. They leave, they become civilians, and everyone is satisfied. They believe that this is then no longer a military problem, she added. Nothing could be further from the truth. The crime took place in the military, and the military should feel responsible. That, Madam Chair, is just a very brief excerpt from an article in the Polish press, Poland, again, a NATO ally. This article is from October last year, the very same problem in a closely allied military with the same tenor of testimony that we've seen here. So again, this reinforces the systematicity of the issue we're facing, and it exceeds our borders. Let me turn back, if I may, to the introduction to the experience of New Zealand. New Zealand had an independent review dated June 2020 of progress against this action plan for Operation Respect. Operation Respect, in a very rough analogy, would be similar to the former Operation Honor, an initiative launched by the New Zealand Defence Forces. And there are five significant changes that were recommended that the New Zealand Defence Forces make or should make. And I think that was the point where I was interrupted last time, Madam Chair, and we suspended our meeting. These five elements are the following. To be transparent and accountable by engaging oversight and monitoring of progress by a trusted body or entity such as the Auditor General. To provide a trusted external and independent complaints channel like that offered by the Defence Ombudsman in Australia to receive, investigate, and remedy cases of harmful behaviour and sexual violence. To actively promote the Safe Talk helpline as an external and independent support channel for victims of sexual harm. To create a comprehensive and integrated data management system to assess progress against clear outcome measures and report on complaints and outcomes of incidents of harmful behavior. And fifthly, to engage leaders at all levels collectively to own and lead the management of harmful behavior, including sexual violence, discrimination, bullying, and harassment in the New Zealand Defence Forces. So that's the top level set of recommendations by this review. And Madam Chair, the fundamental element of the insights that they have gained is very similar in terms of the tenor of the discussions that we have faced and that we're dealing with. The terms of reference of this particular review process are 7 in number. The review was to establish a strategy to change the New Zealand Defence Forces culture, to increase training and education, to provide an alternative way to report sexual assault, to create a dedicated professional sexual assault response team, to assess specific risk factors associated with facilities and alcohol, to recruit more women into the armed forces and increase female representation in senior leadership roles, and to monitor and further reduce discrimination, harassment, and bullying. And just a brief reference with respect to the 6th element, the Minister has spoken frequently about the pipeline that we need to build here in Canada to have significantly larger numbers of women in senior ranks. It has been referred to this committee as the male toxicity, the culture, the negative culture, the harmful culture that persists primarily in senior ranks. So to change that culture, one of the recommendations that this committee should turn its mind to with urgency is to support the creation and maintenance of a talent pipeline that allows Canadian Forces members, female Canadian Forces members, to progressively move into senior ranks of the organization. The New Zealand report is very careful to note that they were not mandated to investigate or make factual findings about the substance or merit of any specific or individual incidents or allegations. New Zealand did not suffer the same experience, to my knowledge, that we did with respect to the Chief of Defence Staff actually being personally subject to complaint while at the helm of an operation that was supposed to achieve the very culture change that we are mandated to address. So they are looking at the second component that I outlined in the beginning, the mechanisms, the recommendations, the pathways to achieving culture change in New Zealand. And for that reason, I submit this experience is directly relevant to what we are doing at this very moment. The approach that this body took to measuring progress has a number of elements. They discussed the methodology that they used. They discuss how they drew themes from the volume of different perspectives. On terminology, they make some important observations that would be relevant to consideration of the efforts that are underway before our committee. With respect to commonly understood terms such as victim, target, complainant, and accused throughout the report, it is a reference to people who experience, report, or are accused of inappropriate or harmful behavior, whether bullying, harassment, discrimination, or some form of sexual violence. Terms such as rape, sexual assault, and sexual violence are frequently used interchangeably and are not intended to align with any legal definitions. In this report, we generally use the all-encompassing term sexual violence to describe not just physical violence like sexual assault, but also acts of sexual intimidation that do not involve physical contact. Direct references to other documents use terminology as used in the original, such as the Operation Respect Action Plan, that refers to both sexual assault and harmful and inappropriate sexual behavior. So again, the definitions are incredibly important, not only in scoping the reference of the review exercise that's underway in this case, but also when it comes to the formulation of recommendations and communicating with the Canadian public to make sure that we're sufficiently inclusive and also sensitive with respect to experiences of victims involved. The report then says in a section, what your people told us, talks about the feedback they received from members of the armed forces in the review. And they state that overall participants shared a wide range of experiences and opinions. In this report, we have tried to provide a balanced account of what we were told during the course of the review. Many different situations and experiences were described to us. Not all were related to experiencing or witnessing harmful behavior or sexual violence, but many of the experiences were painful and distressing in the retelling and involved personal costs to those who shared them so frankly with us. Many explained that they had chosen to share with us as we were independent and were providing them a safe and confidential place. Many thanked us for what they described as a cathartic experience. We heard from individuals who have experienced verbal, mental, physical, and sexual abuse or violence from colleagues. We also heard of domestic and family violence. We heard about the serious impacts that such experience have on individuals' health and well-being. We also heard about how the New Zealand Defence Force's failure to act or to resolve situations in a timely way often compounded the original trauma and resulted in highly stressful situations for all those concerned, including wider personnel and staff. Personnel, past and present, including senior personnel who were directly involved in policy development, the initiatives that sit under the areas under review and the implementation of the same, shared openly their views on progress or the lack thereof. To protect the anonymity of individual participants, we cannot share the specific details of individuals or the information, opinions, or experiences provided to us. One common refrain was that people do not feel that they can safely speak out within the New Zealand Defence Forces. It is important to understand that we are not reflecting back the voices of just a few, but of many. We reviewed two very clear and consistent messages following most group sessions and individual interviews. People were surprised and grateful that we did not just present another Operation Respect briefing, but that we asked for opinions and experiences. And they sought our reassurance that we would tell it like it is and make their voices heard. In this report, we have endeavored to do that. And Madam Chair, there's some additional extremely relevant elements that I think I will go back to in a second intervention, but I just wanted to put this forward to the committee as a reflection of the similarity, the very strong similarity of the experience in New Zealand to what this committee is confronted with, to make sure that we put the testimony of victims front and center, as I think my colleagues on the Liberal side have done in the past few weeks of interventions in this particular session of the meeting, and that we develop not only recommendations that help us move forward, but a sensitive way of empowering victims of sexual misconduct to come to this committee, and then obviously in the future to build mechanisms that raise the confidence of those who are still serving and those who have served to come forward and to bring complaints to be heard, and to have the assurance that the voice of this committee as a parliamentary committee, as the parliamentary committee seized with this issue, that we will take it seriously and that we will develop recommendations that will expeditiously bring us into a much better space. I will leave it there for the moment, Madam Chair, but I'd like to come back and present some additional elements of this particular review that I think will be very helpful to members of the committee.
All right, thank you very much. On to Mr. Bagnall, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'd like to welcome Mr. Kelly if he's still here. So my comments, I hope he finds some interesting information today. So my comments aren't related to him on this, my first intervention today, because he hasn't been at the committee. But it's really perplexing to me as to why the NDP and Conservatives and Bloc would not want to help them.
Point of order, Madam Chair.
Go ahead, Madame Ellslev.
Just so you know, Mr. Kelly has left.
Oh, okay.
Thank you, Madame Ellslev.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Mr. Bagnall.
So yeah, it's really perplexing to me as to why the NDP, Conservatives and Bloc would not want to help the men and women in the military by having the government respond to the recommendations that we come up with. Why would we have gone to all this work over months if the Conservatives, NDP and Bloc do not want the government to respond to our recommendations and improve the lives of the men and women in the forces and to show the victims they were listened to? And that's the purpose of my amendment. You know, Yvonne Baker and I agree on an item that we came to Parliament to accomplish positive change, to improve Canada. And MP Baker asked a very good question in a previous meeting. When we've all retired and look back at this winter-spring session of Parliament, of the Defence Committee, what then can we say we've accomplished? Did we agree on many recommendations to help the thousands of victims existing or women existing in the military? No. Did we do a thoughtful, lengthy debate and recommendations on the complicated challenges of changing the culture? No. Did we do a thoughtful, lengthy debate and recommendations on a second major problem involved of the chain of command? No. Did we do a lengthy debate and agree on recommendations on the third major problem, the fear of reprisals? No. Did we help our soldiers around the world survive the terrible COVID pandemic that was killed so many? Not yet. Did we help so many of them afflicted with some internally tortured with mental health afflictions? Not yet. Did we help the Navy procure needed warships? No. Did our committee help the Air Force procure the next generation of needed warplanes? No. Did we help keep our troops around the world safe? Do we help in Lithuania and Ukraine? No. Did we address the Russian or Chinese military aggression? No. Did our committee help make the world safer with our recommendations on peacekeeping? No. Did we take into serious consideration the hundreds of emails, complaints, hours of witness testimony or potential testimony to come up with the recommendations? No. Did we modernize NORAD? No. But I'll tell you what the Conservatives, NDP, and Bloc have accomplished. We've had week after week after week of witness after witness to fully investigate one anonymous email that the person didn't want public, so no one knows what was in it. At one point, they even suggested recalling witnesses on that email. Since they have caused this endless stalling by refusing to cooperate for the good of the troops and try to force a motion through that would only allow 2 minutes of debate, the motion we're talking about, on the serious topics related to improvement for our military. In a subsequent submission, I'll go into how that just doesn't make sense. In answer to Mr. Baker's question on what we did accomplish, but the fact that opposition is stalling week after week after week with their unreasonable motion doesn't mean every member of the committee has accomplished nothing. In fact, a good researcher could do a chart on each member of the last few weeks outlining how many times did a member bring up valuable input from victims to the committee and get it on the record so it could lead to improvements in the military? How many times did a member bring and put on record input from experts that would help us design recommendations to help men and women in the military? How many times did a member bring valuable input from other militaries who have found some solutions to the problems we are wrestling with? And how many times has each member raised constructive input on perhaps the biggest problem we are wrestling with, culture? How many times over the last few weeks has a member discussed the key major problems related to chain of command? How many times has a member discussed the threat of reprisals if a CAF member actually reports sexual misconduct? In fact, that researcher could also read each party on how many times in the last few weeks they each made a positive contribution to those three major problems leading to sexual misconduct in the military: chain of command, fear of reprisals, and culture. I would be curious to the results of that research, but my gut reaction is that Mr. Spengeman and Mr. Baker have made the most number of positive contributions to the study by bringing most of the evidence related to those major issues to our committee. But it's not too late for all committee members to contribute if the opposition would stop stalling the retraction of their unreasonable motion and have the government respond to the committee's work, which is what my amendment today. And we could use various ways to move forward. One was my suggestion that we quickly go through the recommendations that we can all agree on, and I'm sure there would be a number of them. And then, go into the more difficult ones that we couldn't agree on. But I'll leave it at that for Madam Chair, and I'll get into on my next intervention. I'll get more into the item of culture. Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right. Thank you very much. On to Mr. Baker, please.
Thanks, Madam Chair. And I want to thank Mr. Bagnall for what he just said, for his thoughtful intervention. First of all, for his kind words, but most importantly, for really kind of summarizing the cost of the political game playing that the opposition is leading at this committee, and the cost in terms of the positive impact we could be having on a whole series of issues that matter to so many people in so many different contexts, whether that be equipping the armed forces, whether that be our position in foreign conflicts, whether that be securing our own Arctic and our own future and our own interests, or whether that be sexual harassment, sexual assault in the military. So I want to thank Mr. Bagnall for summarizing the opportunity cost, if you will, of the political game playing that the opposition has undertaken since this study began, and has driven us away from delivering the positive results that we should be delivering for folks, and particularly for the members of the forces. I want to focus our attention on what I think our report and our committee should be focused on, which is addressing the issue of sexual harassment and sexual assault in the military, the issue of addressing the concerns that survivors and victims have raised, that experts have raised over and over and over again. And as much as I've been criticized by some members of the opposition for trying to give, and I and my colleagues on the government side have been criticized for trying to share with this committee the perspectives, the testimony of victims and survivors. I'm going to keep sharing it. I know my colleagues have continued to share that perspective because to me that should be our focus. That should be our focus, not the political game playing that has been the focus of the opposition. So, in that vein, what I did want to do was to share with you some thoughts that were shared by a survivor, Ms. Emily Tillich, to the committee, the Standing Committee on the Status of Women, and I think her perspective. Well, when you hear her perspective, I think you'll understand why I'm sharing it. But I think it shines a light on what's at stake, and why we should be writing a fulsome report with a government response, like Mr. Bagnall has proposed in his amendment, and why I hope that Mr. Bazan will still consider withdrawing his motion, which Mr. Bagnall has tried to constructively amend. But I hope Mr. Bazan will withdraw his motion, because it is Mr. Bazan's motion. Mr. Bazan's motion would result in a report that would not allow us to properly and thoughtfully analyze the issues, what we've heard, to really identify all the components of the problem that are driving sexual assault, sexual misconduct in the military, and that would allow us to develop and compile the solutions to those problems, and would not allow us ultimately to therefore address that problem, and therefore would not allow us, Mr. Bazan's motion would not allow us to address the needs of survivors, of victims. And they are begging us for that work. They are asking us to take action over and over again. They've asked us to take action for years. So I think this committee should heed their call. But I'm going to repeat one of those calls here today. Ms. Emily Tillich was testifying to the Standing Committee on the Status of Women, and she said, "I joined the Canadian Armed Forces in July of 2018. Since then, I feel like I've experienced a lifetime's worth of sexual assault and misconduct. I'm here today to tell you that I was raped only 1 month into my basic training in Saint-Jean. I was also sexually assaulted during my training in Borden. I have been groped and kissed unwillingly at crew parties and mess events. These degrading behaviors are more common than you think. On top of all of that, I have put up with misogynistic and sexist comments all throughout my career. They range from being told that I only got in because I'm a girl, to what an instructor in Borden said to me while looking me dead in the eye: if you've had daddy fix everything for you in your cozy little life, let us know so we can give you a hand." I believe in the importance of the military. I hope to continue my career and to serve my country to the best of my abilities. My experience with our military justice system, however, has been quite negative. it has left me with a lot of questions about how military police should conduct their investigations. I had 3 interviews with the military police since I first reported misconduct. 2 of those interviews were honestly dreadful. These so-called interviews felt more like interrogation. I want to pause there for a second, because I think it's important to reflect on what Emily Tillichus is sharing. First of all, her talking about the fact that she was raped 1 month into basic training in Saint Jean, and then sexually assaulted during her training in Borden. And that is what we should be stopping. This is the issue that we should be singularly focused with. Like, we should be focused on solving the problem that Emily Tulloch and others have shared with us, which is that women primarily, but members of the forces, are sexually harassed and sexually assaulted. And in Ms. Tulloch's case, 1 month into her training, sexually assaulted by someone who's purportedly a colleague, who's purportedly to serve, who swears the same oath, who supposedly believes in serving our country. And treats a fellow Canadian, a fellow armed forces member this way. This is what we should be focused on. Like, doing everything we can to come together, to shed our partisan labels, and just write a good report. Do right by victims who have suffered in ways I can't possibly comprehend. And Mr. Bazan's motion does not allow us to do that. It prevents us from doing that. It took me over 2 minutes just to share Ms. Tulloch's story. And Mr. Bazan's motion would force us to write a report where each MP gets 2 minutes to speak, and then boom, we move on to the next clause or the next paragraph. And then that would not give us enough time to, and it would not be based on consensus, because as Mr. Bazan's motions indicate, we'd all just vote on each clause, whether up or down, and move on. Like, I think survivors deserve much better than that. And I don't understand how, I just don't understand how you can listen to something like this, to what Ms. Tulloch has shared with our colleagues, and think that this shouldn't be our priority as a committee. I don't understand why we would pass a motion, which Mr. Bazan proposed, that would handcuff us, would prevent us from addressing what Ms. Tulloch is telling us. Ms. Tulloch is not alone. We know that. We've all spoken to that. We know this is a widespread problem. And Mr. Bazan's motion is effectively would force this committee to basically look the other way. And even worse than look the other way, it would require this committee to write a report that claims to address this issue and it actually wouldn't. It's worse because it's misleading. This is, folks, people are suffering. And Mr. Bazan's motion is about grabbing headlines and claiming to have done something when nothing has been done. And that's why I hope that he'll withdraw it. Not because it's politically convenient, but because it's the right thing to do. And because I don't know a single person who can't help be touched by this kind of testimony. And this kind of testimony is exactly what we should be. Every time I read, every time I come to this committee and I share with you some of these stories, like this testimony is on my mind for hours afterwards. Hours after our committee meetings, I'm still thinking about what these women have gone through and are going through. And I don't know, somehow there are members on this committee for whom it doesn't have that impact, or maybe they don't, or maybe the politics are more important to them than this, but this should be our focus. Ms. Tulloch talks about she believes in the importance of the military. She hopes to continue her career. And I flag that only to say that Ms. Tulloch testified in a public setting at a House of Commons committee and shared what I've shared with you, and still hopes to serve. And I applaud her for her courage, not just for sharing this in a public realm. That takes a tremendous amount of courage, but she's done so and still wants to serve in the military. And I think that just demonstrates to what degree Ms. Tulloch and others are asking us to act and are asking us for help. And I underline that just to say, colleagues, friends, let's respond to that call. We should be responding to that call. Mr. Bagnall has proposed an amendment that makes a lot of sense. It basically just says, like, look, if the committee's report needs to be responded to by government, so the government is held, in my view, the value of Mr. Bagnall's, one of the key reasons for Mr. Bagnall's motion is that it requires government to put on the record what it's going to do in response to this committee's recommendations, to this committee's concerns. Mr. Bagnall, I believe it was Mr. Bagnall earlier in our discussion today, mentioned eliminating that requirement, which is a standard requirement for committee reports. It's a standard requirement included by committees that are serious about having government act on their recommendations. By removing that, by proposing that the removal of a government response, which is what the opposition have done, they've basically said, no, they don't really care what government does. Like, why are we all here as MPs if we don't care what government does on an issue like this? Why are we here? Like, I cannot get my head around why the opposition would go out of its way to say we don't want the government to act on what we recommend. Is it because they don't think it's a serious problem? Like, is it because they think, because they don't put a lot of stock in what we're going to recommend? Anyway, I think the fact that Ms. Tulloch and others who are active serving members of the armed forces have had the courage to come forward, that we owe it to them to, we have to appreciate how much courage that takes, how important this is, and therefore how important it is that be our focus. Ms. Tulloch, I'd read to you in the latter part of what I read from Ms. Tulloch's testimony about her experience. She started describing her experience with the military police, and I think it's important to hear the perspective of the people who are interacting with the military police, and how, when I read Ms. Tulloch's testimony, I should read some more, to be frank, so that we have the full context and fairness. But the fact that she feels the way she does, she felt the way she did when when interacting with the military police, speaks to another component of this problem that this committee needs to be taking on and addressing in our report and recommending solutions for and holding government accountable for solving. So I want to read a little bit more from what Ms. Tulloch had to say. She says 2 of those interviews were honestly dreadful. These so-called interviews felt more like interrogation. During these interviews, I felt that investigators were not treating me like a human being. I was just another case file to them. There was no empathy or humanity. It was so frustrating that I left early during the second interview. I felt like I wasn't being heard. I was being treated like a criminal. No one should be treated like a criminal when they're that vulnerable and in need of help. I'm going to pause there for a moment. Ms. Tulloch is the victim and is describing treatment that I think we could all agree has to stop. And she's talking about the fact that she needs help and instead being treated like a criminal. And I'm not professing to be the expert. In fact, all of us who've heard testimony from experts and from survivors need to sit down as we write the report and discuss and debate and figure out how we want to tackle this particular element of this much broader problem. This is just one element of a much broader problem. But we need to address this. This is and again, Mr. Bazan's motion would prevent us from doing that. Ms. Tulloch goes on to say the military police need to improve their training for how to conduct interviews of sexual assault victims. There needs to be a specific course made to teach them that victims need understanding and empathy. If there already is a course, then they need to tear it apart and rebuild it from the ground up. So I'm going to pause there again. Is this something we would recommend as a committee? Is it in our report? Will it be in our report? Is it something that if we pass Mr. Bazan's motion, this wouldn't be something that members who feel strongly about this could fight for and debate and discuss? This could get voted out. It might not even be in there for all I know, but it should be in there as far as I'm concerned. I'm sure many of my colleagues would agree, on all sides of the aisle would agree, that the recommendations to solve this problem of how military police investigate these allegations, that has to be in there. But we can't do that if we pass Mr. Bazan's motion, because Mr. Bazan's motion doesn't allow us to discuss it except for 2 minutes. And good luck. I've spent 2 minutes just sharing what Ms. Tulloch told us. How would we ever come to consensus in 2 minutes? So this is another example of the issues. I'm conveying this. I'm conveying what Ms. Tulloch told us because I want us to refocus on what we should be focused on here, in my view, and how complex the issue, how multifaceted and complex the issue is that we're facing, and how many components there are likely to be to the solution if we're serious about solving it. And therefore, how Mr. Bazan's motion would prevent us from doing that. How Mr. Bagnall has proposed a government response. At the very least, what Mr. Bagnall has done is constructive. He's tried to say, look, let's at least find consensus that whatever we do recommend needs to be tackled by the government. But Ms. Tulloch is talking about just one of the many elements of this problem. And the opposition is basically supporting a motion that allows them to say, well, we wrote a report on this topic, but does nothing to address the issues that face survivors. The survivors have faced and continue to face. I mean, I know others want to speak, Madam Chair, so I'm going to pause there. I would just ask us to let's just refocus on the survivors and focus on writing a solid report. Thanks very much.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Baker. Mr. Garrison, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I apologize that my raise hand function keeps going off and on its own, and I'm not sure why that's the case. I want to take a few minutes to talk about the question that Liberal members keep raising in this committee and in the House, and that is questioning the motives of opposition members in dealing with this study. I raised earlier with the chair that I think that this is actually a question of privilege. I think that it is a violation of the rules of the House of Commons to reflect on the motives of other members, and in particular, to reflect on the way they do their jobs. And even if it's not found to be in violation of privilege, it's clear that it's not productive. And so we can sit all day and argue about motives, and we will make no progress on anything. And I have to say, on the charge of partisanship, at the risk of committing the offense I'm actually complaining about, that I think this may be a bit more about projection on the part of Liberal members than it is on the reality that we're facing. But let me talk about my motives on this study very directly. And I'll talk, first of all, about why I believe this study is important and what I believe this study is about on principle. The purpose of this study from the beginning has been to look at why there was no effective action to combat sexual misconduct in the military over the last 6 years. And in particular, why no action was taken in 2018 when allegations of sexual misconduct were made against General Vance, and why he was allowed to stay in charge of Operation Honor for nearly 3 years after that. And why he was even given a salary increase. The Liberal members persist in ignoring the fact that the Status of Women Committee is conducting a study on what should be done in the future to address sexual misconduct. They are the ones who heard from victims. They are producing a report with those recommendations, which I understand will be tabled shortly in the government in the House of Commons. So for me, the key question here is, all those good recommendations that I believe the Status of Women Committee will make will come to no good end if we don't understand why all the good recommendations made by Madam Justice Deschamps 6 years ago weren't implemented and didn't cause progress on this problem within the military. How did we face more than 500 sexual assault cases while Operation Honor was in place? Why did we face a total of more than 800 when you combine sexual assault and sexual harassment while Operation Honor was in place? So all the good recommendations that any House of Commons committee can make will come to naught if we don't understand why the previous recommendations weren't followed, weren't implemented, and there was no progress. And to me, that is being concerned about survivors, helping survivors understand why nothing happened in their cases. And it's about future survivors, making sure there aren't as many as we've had in the past, and in fact, trying to achieve the goal that there be no more survivors of sexual misconduct. But if we don't find no progress was made, we'll never get there. And that is the central part of this report. Now I want to speak more directly and personally about my motivations in this study and how much I do believe this is about supporting victims. As an adult survivor of child abuse, I know a lot about being a victim of sexual assault. I know a lot about what it feels like to try and tell your story and not be believed. I know a lot about what it feels like to talk to people who should have known or did know and took no action. I know a lot about how it feels when no action was taken, and you find later, as in my case, there were 8 other victims of the same behavior, some of them very close to me. So I do resent being told that I don't care about survivors because of the political positions I might be taking here. I resent it a great deal. It took me a long time to accept that what happened to me happened as a child. But when I tried to bring these things forward as an adult, I faced all those same challenges that survivors of sexual misconduct in the military face now. So I believe that coming to a conclusion and examining very carefully about why effective action didn't happen is taking the part of survivors and is the most important part of what we can do in the Defense Committee. The Status of Women Committee has heard from many survivors. They've heard much of the testimony that's being repeated here. It is shocking and disturbing testimony. There is no doubt about that. But as I said, Status of Women Committee, I understand, is very close to tabling their report, which will have recommendations about that. So I guess I will leave that there, but I really will not tolerate people arguing that because of what I think is important here and the way I wish to approach this means I don't care about survivors. It's not true on principle, and it's certainly very untrue personally. Now, let's be clear. This is about the Minister of Defense record over the last 6 years. It's not about who he is as a person. And certainly, I want to be very clear that the Minister of Defense is not the victim here. The victims are those who were subject to sexual misconduct on his watch and who saw no effective action taken against it. I guess let me turn then to what I've said before, that there needs to be a rule against gaslighting. There needs to be a rule against this creation of an alternative universe here, where the reason we haven't gotten to the report on mental health and the reason we haven't gotten to finish the report on COVID is the Liberal filibuster that's been going on. Whether it was a previous motion about who's to be called as a witness or whether it's about the motion in front of us. And when the Liberals say they don't understand why a motion would have time limits, the Conservative motion seems clear to me that it has time limits in it because of Liberal filibusters and preventing us from being able to reach conclusions and issue a report. And when the members go on and on about why would a committee report not ask for a response from the government and how it always happens, it's not true. The Justice Committee just issued a report on coercive and controlling behavior. And the committee did not ask for a government response. And you know why? They said because the government had already testified before the committee, and the government needed to get busy on the recommendations rather than writing a response to the committee, that there was more important work to do than responding to the committee. So it isn't true that every committee report always asks for a government response, and it's certainly not true that not asking for a response means you don't think this is an important issue. You might, in fact, think it's something the government should get busy on rather than spending time coming back to tell us in committee what they've already told us many times. So I would very much like to have finished the report on mental health in the Canadian military. But Liberal members, including the chair of the committee, made the decision to stay on the topic of sexual misconduct, despite the offers of the opposition to finish the report on mental health in the military and COVID in the military, and then return to this question. Those overtures were rejected. And I believe it was a form of placing pressure on the opposition members to give up our inquiry into why there was no effective action in order to get the reports on COVID in the military and the report on mental health. And before someone says that never happened, I'll just remind honorable members that I don't delete my tweets. I don't delete the text messages that I receive from people. And so I hope that members won't bother denying that this was a pressure tactic placed on opposition members. So where are we now? If we don't finish a report today, it will not be tabled before we rise for the summer. And the Liberal filibuster today ensures that will not happen. That also means we will not finish the report on mental health in the military. And it means we will not finish the report on COVID in the military. And given the saber rattling occurring all around the House of Commons, this in fact may be one of the last meetings of this committee in this Parliament. And so it is not the opposition who has blocked progress on all these other topics. It's the consistent filibustering by the Liberals. Now, I'm not reflecting on why the Liberals have done this. I frankly don't understand it. We've been trying to get at the bottom of why there was no effective action against General Vance, and on why the implementations of the Deschamps report weren't fully implemented, and on why sexual misconduct is still rampant in the Canadian military. And I believe that answering those questions is the central task before us as the Defense Committee. And I'm very disappointed that the Liberal filibuster prevents us from answering that question. Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right. Thank you very much. Monsieur Robillard, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In order to truly understand the problems of sexual misconduct in the Canadian Armed Forces, we also need to understand the culture in the Canadian Armed Forces. Much as Mr. Spangeman has done, I will discuss culture in the Canadian Armed Forces. As Dr. Maya Eschler has pointed out, even in a supposedly neutral military organization, the military culture continues to reproduce the idea that male masculinity is an ideal as long as no effort is made to change this basic premise. This gender-based culture has remained in place even after the court's decision in 1999, and it has become a true barrier to women being able to integrate the Canadian Armed Forces. It's very important to note this because it's only by looking closely at trauma that people have sustained in the past that we will be able to prevent future trauma. The soldier experience has remained a gendered one. Researchers and specialists have shown us that women in the Canadian Armed Forces are faced with a dilemma. They can be seen as being too masculine, or they're seen as too feminine. To be seen as true soldiers, they must behave like men, but they mustn't, for all that, lose their femininity. Some terms are heard over and over again, some ways of expressing the problem. The feeling that you're always having to show something special to others, being pointed out in strange ways, being treated as though you're someone who's not a member of the group, being ridiculed, being harassed, sexually harassed as well, being asked to carry out quote-unquote feminine tasks, and so on. Here again, we see clearly that this is an old culture. It's an outdated culture, and we as a government must deal with it.
This goes to show that there is inequity between the genders. It was considered normal, even if we had neutrality policy and equal of access. Women had to find their own strategy, so to fully participate and assert their identity or simply leave the armed forces. This explains why there is a very low level of women's participation in the CAF, which is about 15%. This participation is very unequal if we look at the organizational chart. If we look at it closely, women are overwhelmingly present in jobs considered to be women's jobs. Medical, dental positions, secretariat positions, but they're underrepresented in senior positions. We have to take into account these facts in our response, and we should allow our government to respond. The limited integration of women is obvious, especially in combat roles. 25 years after the decision of the Canadian Tribunal on Human Rights, the combat roles are almost exclusively held by men who closely identify to the ideal of the male warrior. In 2016, there was only 2.5% women in the regular forces and 5.5% in the reserves in combat roles. The media coverage of the Canadian intervention in Afghanistan showed that this neutral principle of gender was dominant if we looked at the role of women in the armed forces. In 2006, Captain Nicolas Godard, the first woman to be in combat, attracted more media attention on women soldiers deployed in Afghanistan. military speakers and members of the CAF that were interviewed in this regard were stating that gender was not to be considered. For example, in an article on the death of Godard in the Toronto Star, a spokesperson of the National Defense Department shows this. CAF and National Defense consider a soldier as a soldier regardless of gender, that there is a neutral approach. And for MDN, that was a strategy. And it made public relations easier in relation to the death of Captain Godard. There was an internal correspondence made public following an access to information, and we see that there was a real effort to minimize the gender of Captain Godard. In the email, it said, everyone in theater, in the operations theater, is a soldier. Dozens of access to information from the media aimed at interviewing women. They wanted to have a profile of a woman in combat. These access to information were refused. DND were talking about the death of a soldier in combat and the public reaction following this death. So the leaders decided to adopt a neutral approach according to based on gender. That was their strategy in their response. Mrs. Solander and Catherine Tribanen said so, and it seems possible that when they say gender is neutral, it's not only an assertion as media and armed forces imply. It is an intelligent response on a technical point. We're talking about a woman being in a very male-dominated area. Even Godard didn't want to be looked at more closely because she was a woman. She wanted to integrate the male group. Other women made some comments in the same regard in the media. For example, Major Eleanor Taylor, the first Canadian to be commander of an infantry in a combat theater, said clearly that she did not want to get attention on her because she was a women commander of a company. Men in similar positions have the same challenges as she does. So I don't think the fact that I'm a woman is relevant, said she. That's what they think in my organization. The principle of gender neutrality makes it that women soldiers carry the responsibility of integrating into the masculine standard in the forces. So neutrality does not lead the force to change. This culture remains as is today. Indeed, some studies show that the military culture is based on gender, even though if they seem to show gender neutrality. Donna Winslow and Jennison Dunn showed that combat roles focus on traditional values and behaviors that are very male-based. The warrior, the male warrior, so they resist to women's integration. Misogynistic attitudes, homophobic attitudes are current within the combat staff. It was documented in 2005 in a study by the CAF. Once they didn't have the legal obstacles, and their view of the male warrior had an harmful impact on women in combat roles. Once more, we have to take into account this in our response, and we shall allow our government to give us a response to solve this issue. As Cabert showed, employment policies in DND do not put into question this ideology of the warrior. They talk about neutrality of gender, but that didn't allow a change of culture in the military. This was confirmed in the Deschamps report. Thank you so much, Madam Chair.
Mr. Spengeman, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And I want to start by thanking our colleague Randall Garrison for his past intervention just a few moments ago. He and I served on this committee in the 42nd Parliament. I've got a great deal of respect for him, and we've done some great work together, including, as I mentioned in previous interventions, the report on diversity and inclusion of the 42nd Parliament. In the 42nd Parliament through this committee, which also made reference to sexual misconduct. With respect to other committees doing their work, and he mentioned the work that's going on in the Status of Women Committee. Madam Chair, I think it's important for us to keep in mind that each committee is the master of its own destiny, and just because one committee is doing a report doesn't necessarily mean that another committee should or should not do a similar report. In this case, one might well argue that, in fact, if two committees were to come to similar conclusions, this would strengthen the importance of the issue and would further catalyze government action. And in fact, it's the systematicity of the issue that's the opportunity for this committee to have the chance to study the case of the former Chief of Defence Staff, the behavior that we've been focused on for the past months, but also the question of culture change, and to put forward recommendations or a report that addresses this issue in its entirety and really gets to the bottom of what the challenge is. And I want to just sort of circle back for a moment to the submissions I'd made on New Zealand, and to put to colleagues that this review in New Zealand, the independent review of their operation, which is called Operation Respect, in a nonpartisan way exposes some of the reasons to which Mr. Garrison was pointing, or the questions anyway, as to why it is so difficult to achieve action, or has been difficult here in Canada since the Deschamps report. Even with a commitment from government, there are structural systemic barriers, I think, that the New Zealand case exposes, that this committee could and should focus on, and make recommendations to overcome them. So I will outline some of those for the benefit of members. And I will conclude with a couple of portions from that report on culture change. I understand that my colleague, Mr. Bagnall, wishes to address that issue later, and I think that'll connect well with what he will likely say with respect to the importance of culture change. But in New Zealand, the key question before this independent review committee was the following: what progress has the New Zealand Defence Force made in creating a culture of dignity and respect through the implementation of its Operation Respect action plan? And the independent review concludes that the initial Operation Respect action plan and work was well resourced and commenced quickly and with energy. The successful implementation of the Sexual Assault Response Team, or SART, and the two-track disclosure process is a significant step forward. These features, along with the Sexual Ethics and Responsible Relationships, or SERR training, has become the positive face of Operation Respect in New Zealand. The New Zealand Defence Forces laid the foundation of a positive program of culture change, but it has not managed to maintain a consistent and thorough approach to its ongoing strategy or implementation. Momentum, visibility, and focus have been lost. Again, this is a non-political, non-partisan message from New Zealand explaining that despite this initiative, progress was slow and was not optimal. Despite positive efforts, there has been insufficient progress since the plan was launched in creating a culture of dignity and respect generally, and in preventing or promptly addressing harmful behavior, including sexual violence specifically. We were also asked to assess whether the NZDF is well placed to achieve the key actions and outcomes described in the action plan by assessing whether resource allocation and organizational structures and processes are appropriately configured to achieve success. The conclusion, it is our view that at this time, the New Zealand Defence Forces are not currently positioned to drive the change required, given the capacity and capability challenges in strategy, planning, resourcing, and budget, compounded by 3 fundamental challenges and a number of other barriers to progress. And the report outlines the following. We set out below 3 key reasons why culture change has been hard to achieve. There's a lack of transparency and accountability of the NZDF's progress in addressing and preventing harm that continues to be experienced as a result of sexual violence and/or discrimination, bullying, and harassment. Second, a code of silence prevails, and many personnel will not raise a complaint or report serious issues such as sexual violence because they fear the repercussions and do not trust the NZDF processes and systems. And third, the culture of military discipline and command makes it difficult for personnel to raise concerns or speak out against the behavior or decisions made by their immediate manager or others more senior in the hierarchy. Again, things that we've heard from various sources here in Canada, reinforced by the experience in New Zealand, again, without any partisan or political or even parliamentary overtones. The barriers to progress for Operation Respect are outlined in the following summary format. There's 12 barriers. The organization's culture is changing slowly, but it is difficult to break the code of silence. The strategy for culture change needs to foster collective ownership. Operation Respect is driven from headquarters with varying levels of buy-in at camps and bases. The purpose and scope of the program is too broad, has lost focus, and is not well understood. Communications are not well received, and there are branding challenges with the program. Leaders need more tools, support, and incentives to own and drive the change. Leadership structure and reporting lines for Operation Respect have become confused. The budget for the program is insufficient to drive significant change. The roles and responsibilities of those who manage complaints are unclear. The military justice system creates barriers to reporting harmful behavior or sexual violence. And I just want to flag there the intersection that was outlined by my colleague, Ms. Vandenbelt, at a previous session, the important intersection between this work and the work on military justice. 11, without good data collection and management, it is not possible to understand the issues, assess and monitor change, or reduce risk. And 12, monitoring and reporting of progress are rudimentary. Again, there's some insights here that very directly could, and with the committee's collective will, could be mapped onto our experience here in Canada and move us forward out of the current logjam that we find ourselves in, and to actually make some very good progress on the issues. The review body made some more specific findings on the action plan. The action plan had the mandate of establishing a strategy to change the New Zealand Defence Forces culture. The review found that change is not significant or fast enough, and that the prevailing culture continues to be problematic. The action plan had the mandate to increase training and education. And the review found that the sexual ethics and responsible relationships training is well received and opens a difficult dialogue, but needs to be embedded in all training. And I had made previous recommendations or interventions on the issue of training, Madam Chair. The plan was asked to provide an alternative way to report sexual assault. Again, an issue directly relevant to what we're talking about here. The review did not make a finding on that, but did not report any progress. The action plan was to create a dedicated sexual assault response team. And the conclusion was that the 2-track response to sexual violence is an excellent initiative, but the sexual assault response team is stretched and fragile. And it needs an alternative avenue independent of the New Zealand Defence Forces for reporting and seeking support for victims of sexual assault. Again, the tenor, the relevance of these kinds of recommendations, conclusions, and insights is undeniable. Directly the kind of thing that we should be doing here as a committee. 5, the action plan was asked to address specific risk factors associated with facilities and alcohol. That's an issue that we haven't broached in detail, but there are some insights, including the fact that drug usage is an increasing concern. Alcohol consumption may be decreasing, but it's still a major problem with issues to address. Initiation and hazing in the New Zealand Defence Forces continue. 6, the action plan was asked to recruit more women, or to recommend ways to recruit more women into the armed forces and increase female representation in senior leadership roles. The conclusion there is progress is being made, albeit slowly, And I flag here for the committee's reference again the minister's commitment to creating a talent pipeline of women who will move into senior ranks expeditiously within the Canadian Armed Forces. And lastly, Madam Chair, the action plan in New Zealand was asked to monitor and further reduce discrimination, harassment, and bullying. The review found that there's slow progress. The issue is widespread and systemic without pathways or processes for support or resolution. I raise these issues to indicate the systematicity of the problem that armies are facing around the world, including New Zealand. And this analysis, again, is independent, is free from any political interference, and should underscore for members of this committee and the Canadian public some of the structural, cultural obstacles that we're facing here in Canada, and we should turn our minds expeditiously to ways to break that status quo and to get us out of that impasse. If I may, Madam Chair, there's a reference in this report to the fact that the organization, and by that is the New Zealand Defence Forces, is changing slowly, but it is difficult to break the code of silence, not code, CODE. And this will connect us with comments that I think colleagues on our committee will make subsequently on culture change, but I'd like to just make reference to some of these conclusions. Operation Respect in New Zealand is perceived by many as a largely positive initiative that has acknowledged some of the negative issues within the New Zealand Defence Forces culture. The common view of long-serving military personnel is that the NZDF culture has changed in the past decade or two, mostly for the better. References were made to decreased sexism, racism, and drinking. However, the degree to which Operation Respect may have contributed to this over the past 3 years is unclear. Progress may be due to longer-term societal and generational changes, along with New Zealand-wide behavior change strategies such as anti-drink driving and the White Ribbon anti-violence campaigns. Harmful behaviors continue to impact military and civilian personnel. Numerous disclosures were made during the review, including emotional and physical abuse and sexual violence. Forms of discrimination, harassment, and bullying were shared with us that are unacceptable and do not reflect NZDF core values. These are not limited to any one area of the organization and include military on military, military on civilian, and civilian on civilian. These behaviors were frequently in stark contrast to the core values of the NZDF expected of all personnel. As an illustration, people do not have the courage to speak out. Harmful behavior towards colleagues compromises commitment and comradeship, and there's no integrity in choosing to do the wrong thing. Others have noted the importance of the NZDF being seen to be living by these values. Madam Chair, I submit this as just an important reference point on the challenges that New Zealand is facing with respect to culture change. They also call for collective ownership, and they also call for the importance of this being taken on board at the leadership level, at the highest level within the NZDF. The report states that we could not find evidence of a clear change mandate approach or phased plan to support current and future work in the program. Many spoken with said that they believe the approach is reactive or tick box, more about making the NZDF look good rather than actually changing the culture. We note that over recent years, there's been a number of internal or NZDF commissioned reviews and audits. These have generated extensive quote unquote to-do lists, which have perhaps become additional tasks to tick off before prioritizing, implementing, and embedding core aspects of the program. We identified a strong perception that many projects, including those related to Operation Respect, are introduced but not fully embedded before another initiative is launched. And again, we've seen similar developments here. The culture change hasn't materialized. The minister again has said that the door is open, time for patience is over. The culture change needs to be total and complete. But again, Madam Chair, my point has been from the outset that unless this committee seizes itself with the question of culture change in parallel to the question of the accountability of the former Chief of Defence Staff and the investigation surrounding him, to the extent that political discussion of that investigation is even appropriate, unless we are invested in the question of culture, we will not create the value for the Canadian Forces that is so urgently needed. And I'm very grateful to hear that my colleague, Mr. Bagnall, will also address the question of culture change. And I just can't understand for 1 second why that could be or should be sidelined. I mean, yes, there's an important study going on at the Status of Women Committee, and again, that committee also is the master of its own destiny, and there's nothing that restricts it from learning about the defense culture and inviting witnesses from defense. But this, Madam Chair, by virtue of its mandate, is the committee in the House of Commons that is seized with defense questions. And if we were to decide that for some reason the question of culture isn't relevant to our work, or that we should not make recommendations on it, I think we'll have lost a tremendous opportunity. It isn't just about the case of the former Chief of Defense Staff. That's the emblem, the symptom of the problem that has now got nationwide attention. But again, the real work is the iceberg below. And once again, I can do nothing else at the moment, because we are shackled to a view that we should not use our parliamentary procedure to actually debate these recommendations or potential recommendations in a meaningful way. I can do nothing more but to repeat the argument that we must do this work and that we owe nothing less to the serving current, future, and past serving members of the Canadian Forces and the Canadian public. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. On to Mr. Bagnall, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'd like to, I want to address Mr. Garrison, but just before I do, I just want to say thank you to, first of all, Mr. Baker. He always has such moving testimony of the people that are really affected and why we're all here. And I think it brings us back to thinking about how serious it is and how we should be trying to find solutions. There are people who, through no fault of their own, have had such a terrible, terrible situation when they've entered, to protect our company, such an honorable profession. And to thank Mr. Svengaman, who would have thought that our study could be added so much wealth, intellectual wealth from other militaries that had the same issues and that had come up with suggestions that we can think about, and that because it's all in testimony, Madame Arbour certainly will be able to look at in great detail all the things that we've put on record in our committee as she goes through her important work. And also his point that I hadn't thought of about how powerful it'll be we're the first committee doing this, so we've going to try and continue, but how powerful it would be to have two sets of similar recommendations to go to the government, to go to Madame Arbour, to really try and get action to an intractable problem. I did want to talk to Mr. Garrison sincerely. He kind of moved me, so sorry. But his personal story, that took some courage. And so a huge commendation for that. I think he made a very good point about not impugning motives. I think that's the way Parliament should operate. And I've thought about that throughout this committee. It's very hard sometimes in a partisan environment, and I've tried not to. So, Mr. Garrison, if I have any particular time, I certainly apologize for that, because I've certainly tried not to do that, and I'm sure he would support that right across the board. I know it. I'm sure our members have been impugned certain times in these committees, and maybe Mr. Garrison and Elizabeth May and myself should do an analysis of question period a few days to see if we can see both in questions and answers impugned motives, and try and Elizabeth May's made some great input on trying to improve the decorum and what happens in Parliament. And certainly what Mr. Garrison says, I think, is not confined to this committee, but should be a widespread concept that's spread more often. I just think we have a little bit of a different opinion, Mr. Garrison, on, and I'm going to go into something later, Mr. Garrison, just to show you my sincerity, that I wrote a week ago, actually, to say I believed in your sincerity. But on the lack of progress, which he said is very important, and both of us have mentioned numerous times the many instances, the hundreds of instances that continue to occur and have been for decades. But I think the difference we have is that, and I've made in my in the committee in the last couple of weeks, I've mentioned a couple of times that how complex this is, and I've explained, and I will explain not in this intervention, but in my next one on culture, which is fairly lengthy, which I worked on at home. But I'll explain how just because you make rules, for instance, a training rule or this and that, it doesn't necessarily solve the problem. It doesn't stop the problem. And that's why this is so complex. And I think where we differ is that on the aspects that nothing has been done. And it would be a lot worse, actually, if nothing had been done. But I think the point that he and I have made about the ongoing cases just shows the complexity of the problem and why we have to, as I've said several times in committee, to a complex problem, there's no simple solution. But we have, since this minister's come in, made efforts to ensure that there's victims feel supported through the process. There's a case management system to ensure cases are investigated and resolved in a timely manner. There's increased training from experts that is victim-centered and accessible to all CAF members, no matter where they work. And there's ongoing work on a review of unfounded cases. As all members know, there's the passing of C-77, a declaration of victim rights that put victims at the core of military justice system. There's the launching of the Path to Dignity and Respect, a strategy for long-term culture change. On C-77 for victims, we're going to consult the victims. We're working on consulting the victims to draft regulations for this bill. We've consulted federal partners, including the SMR Center, which we've talked about at length in previous meetings, and are developing an online survey to consult as many victims as possible. I'm sure everyone on this committee and the minister numerous times have said any type of inappropriate sexual behavior is totally unacceptable. And I went through, close to an hour of things that have been done. So, I mean, I think it's ingenuous not to acknowledge those facts. Obviously, as Mr. Garrison and I have said, there's numerous things to be still to be done, and that's why we should be dealing with these serious type of issues that we've been talking about for the last couple of weeks. Mr. Garrison, are you able to hear me, Mr. Garrison? Okay, so just to show you that the words I'm writing now are not in response to what you just said, but I wrote them a week ago, I think Sunday night or something last week on this. And I was saying last meeting, Mr. Garrison convinced me more of his sincerity by acknowledging the questions around General Vance's appointment. Our study is about sexual misconduct in the Canadian military, including issues related to General Vance. And Mr. Garrison is the only member of the committee that has made it clear that General Vance's related issues are most important for him, and he has every right to do so. And I think he sincerely believes that. And as I mentioned in a previous meeting, he did some of the best questioning of one of the witnesses related to that. But I have some lengthy input. But Mr. Garrison's, I'd rather, like I say, rather than giving my lengthy input on culture, which I'll do in another intervention, I'd like to just talk about Mr. Garrison's choice for the moment. We each have our priority of what's most important in our study. So in respect to Mr. Garrison's sincerity, I would like to also make my case too, while respecting him. So I'm not a least bit expert in this major problem in the CAF, which is why I base my views on the testimony of victims and the experts. And when I get to my lengthy input on culture, I'll actually refer to the experts again, of an expert referring to experts. But from what I understand from the experts and victims we've heard from, is that this problem goes back for decades, far into the previous century, that the culture is in this and other militaries is one of, if not the biggest, the culture is the biggest issue, if not at least one of the biggest, probably the biggest. And in another intervention, I'll explain how it sort of supports what I've been saying earlier, that you can make technical changes, but that doesn't in itself solve the problem. And one of the experts will say that there's a tiny fraction of all incidents that are actually reported, and that the two major causes of hesitancy to report are the location in the chain of command of reporting and dealing with an incident, and the fear of reprisals, both emotional and to someone's career in which they've invested their life. So from my perspective, if these are the major issues, why would that not be what we're coming to grips with in designing recommendations about to restore the military to a safe workplace and to honor the courage of the victims that have come forward? So now, just to my views of Mr. Garrison's view, which he has every right to have, as I said, and I think he sincerely believes it, and I appreciate his thoughtfulness, but that the issues related to General Vance are the most important part of the study. And in response, I would suggest the following. There are hundreds of perpetrators, a number at the senior level. Why would we base our entire study in weeks and weeks of testimony and witness after witness on an anonymous email related to General Vance that no one was even allowed to know what was in? When we know of or suspect an offense, it's, we turn it over to, anyone turns it over to investigative authorities. And that was done within about 24 hours. General Vance is retired, so he's not going to have any role in solving the pressing issues we were trying to solve. He's already under investigation, and we don't have to do and shouldn't be doing that. And I've tried to put myself into those shoes. If I was told there was an anonymous complaint about any member of this committee, and I wasn't allowed to see or know what it was about, and they had been immediately turned over to the investigators, who went as far as they could because they were refused to have the evidence, what would I do? Would ask that they be kicked out of caucus, or what type of penalty? I definitely could not have mounted a campaign of months. I have to give credit to months and meetings and witnesses to such an email that I knew nothing what was in. So I've heard Mr. Garrison's view, and appreciate it. But for all the reasons I think we have heard from the experts and the survivors, they have outlined the major causes of this sexual misconduct in the military. So for the sake of the men and women in the military, and to honor the survivors, I think we should return to thoughtful discussion of their solutions to the complex problems. I just wanted to comment on one other item, and that was the other reports. The draft reports on mental health in the Canadian Armed Forces and the impact of COVID-19 on the armed forces are sitting unreviewed because we have all these emergency meetings and motions to expand our particular report. As you know, we had a meeting on April 26th to start considering the report on COVID-19 and the CAF, and I believe we made some good progress. But despite this, there was a 1064 that forced us to further delay this report, and we haven't gone back to the review since. So there's nothing that requires us to finish our report, this report we're working on now, before we could proceed to those reports. And I know Mr. Garrison is particularly passionate about one of them. But while we think, at least I think, our committee priority should be the report on sexual misconduct, opposition members know that they could move to proceed to any of our 3 outstanding reports, and they would have our support to do it. But we can't do that while they're pushing to a motion to limit our ability to properly debate and amend this crucial report. So that is their choice. We're not blocking that if they want to take that step and go to those important reports. And so I hope Mr. Garrison knows that I'm sincere in my thoughts on where he's coming from and my technical disagreement on some of the points, but I'm happy to put that forward and pass on, Madam Chair.
All right. Thank you very much. Madame Aleslev, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I just wanted to point out to the committee, because it appears that perhaps they are unaware that the Status of Women report on sexual misconduct in the military has in fact been tabled. There are 21 recommendations, all of which are incredibly important and crucial, not the least of which is the one that talks about freezing all general officer pay and promotions and salary increases until a comprehensive and independent investigation has been done to ensure that they are all beyond reproach. The fact that the Status of Women Committee was able to do the work, including some valuable contributions from the Liberal members of that committee, to do the work that was set before them, and this committee cannot because of the Liberal members, is something that I think we should understand more about, and perhaps the Liberal members on this committee can indicate to us why the Status of Women was able to get a report done, and yet this committee is being filibustered to ensure that we can't, when in fact we probably have even more insight and valuable contribution to make on a report that would be complementary, as the members on this committee have said, to the Status of Women report. So I recommend all members of the committee take a look at that report, because they were able to do what we have yet to be able to do. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Monsieur Robillard.
Mr. Robillard, please. Mr. Robillard, please.
Madame la Présidente.
Madam Chair. In order to be able to understand the issue of sexual misconduct in the Canadian Armed Forces, we must also look into Operation Honor and its application within CAF. So I will address the issue of sexual assault in CAF. As Dr. Maya Etcher has pointed out, even with the prior scandals that have run rampant in CAF over the last 20 years, the whole issue of sexual violence has remained relatively unrecognized by CAF until 2014, year in which articles in Maclean's and Actualité made clear to all that there was sexual misconduct and sexual aggression and harmful behaviors in the CAF. Speaking of women who had experienced these issues within the armed forces, showing that there were still problems despite the formal means of intervening that the plaintiffs undertook. And it showed that sexual misconduct was a recurring problem. In 2015, the outside review of sexual assault and sexual harassment within the Canadian Armed Forces, known as the Deschamps Report, managed to shift the debate regarding sexual violence in the Canadian military. The report showed that our military culture is sexualized and that it's hostile against women and LGBTQ members as well, making for a greater likelihood that sexual assault and sexual harassment occurs. The report questioned the Canadian Armed Forces statements that the general approach was a neutral one and suggested that feminist analysis be applied to the Canadian Armed Forces. If we can manage to change something with our recommendations and requiring a comprehensive response on the part of the government, this would be what we hope for, given that it's been shown that sexual assault is clearly present in our combat forces, and Justice Deschamps clearly underscored that there's a general culture which keeps women from being properly integrated and ensures that they are underrepresented in the senior officer ranks. And she also pointed out that having more women among the senior officers would be a key strategy to bring about a culture change in the Canadian Armed Forces. And she referred to sociology studies demonstrating how much impact the ideal of a male warrior had on women in the forces. CAF's reaction to the publication of the report were a mix. Some applauded the report, others rejected it outright. Moreover, the measures undertaken to apply some of the suggestions made in the report are still underway and not fully ingrained in the Canadian Armed Forces. We can change this with our recommendations and by insisting on a comprehensive response from the government. We must ensure that those who have come forward have not done so in vain. As the Minister has said, all options are on the table. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Much. Mr. Baker, please.
Thanks very much, Madam Chair. I'd like to start by saying a few things about what Mr. Garrison said earlier on, and I first off want to say to Mr. Garrison that I want to thank you for sharing what you shared about what you've gone through. That I have no words. I want to say thank you. That's really courageous. Thank you. The second thing I wanted to say was that it was never my intent to impugn motive, and if I did so, I apologize. I agree with what you said, that the impugning of motive should have no place here, and if I was guilty of that, I apologize. That was not my intent. I think throughout, certainly in my last intervention, I was very, I think I was very, as you can tell, I'm very concerned about us doing everything we can to stop sexual assault, stop sexual harassment from happening in the armed forces. And I was openly, I was trying to identify the reasons why, or I asked the question why we weren't pursuing the writing of the report the way conventionally it's done. And in doing so, I asked about what the rationale might be or what the reasoning might be of some members of the opposition. And that wasn't meant to impugn motive or to make an allegation about another member. It was simply really speculating as to why we weren't going down the path that I thought was in the best interest of survivors. That said, you, in your intervention, you answered that. You explained why you felt that we shouldn't go down that path. You answered those. I don't know if you meant to, but to me, you answered the question that I was openly asking in my prior intervention. So I thank you for answering it. And if it was never meant to impugn motive, but if it did, you have my apologies for that. I think I really appreciated, Mr. Garrison, what you said about why you feel that the report should take a different direction than members on the government side have been advocating for. And I think, like Mr. Bagnall, I respect your point of view, and I actually really I'm thankful that you explained why you feel the way you do. And I don't agree with that. Obviously I see it differently. I've heard what you said. I've heard what you said about the Status of Women Committee, pursuing a report, making recommendations. And I think that report has a tremendous amount of value to the cause of addressing the underlying problem of sexual misconduct in the armed forces. And from my perspective, I really do believe that we have an opportunity as parliamentarians, the members on Status of Women Committee, those of us here on the Defense Committee in particular, obviously those in the senior positions of the armed forces, the minister and his team, the government, have an opportunity, particularly to really make a difference on this issue. And so, that is why I feel that it's so important that all of us put our shoulder to the wheel and pull in that direction. And if that means, from my vantage point, if that means that there's a little bit of, or some, or a lot, I don't know, I'm speculating, of course, but if there's some overlap between what's written in a report by this committee and that of the Status of Women Committee, if there's overlap and we're reinforcing each other, great. All the more, all the better, because we're putting that many more voices, shining that much more of a light, giving that much more voice to those whose voices need to be heard, and driving that much more accountability upon the government, whether this one or the next one or the following one, to heed our recommendations and take action on them. So, and there may be, in the course of writing the report, we might identify additional areas of focus in addition to what the Status of Women Committee has worked on, or we may dive into greater detail in a particular area that the other committee has not. So there's opportunity to reinforce, of course, the other committee's work, but also to build upon it. And so, but all of that to me should be of the highest priority, because I think it really at a critical time, it allows us to make potentially significant steps forward in addressing the underlying problem. But I have to say that I appreciate you responding to or explaining why you feel the report's focus should be slightly different or different, and I honor that perspective. I also wanted to add that, those of us who, one of the things that we could add to this conversation, one of the things that could be in our report that I think is, and one of the things that I value, and it comes from members of all sides of this, from all parties that sit on this committee, is, that we have members on this committee who served in the armed forces or who have worked extensively in the with the armed forces in some capacity, and I think that perspective adds something, brings something to this conversation that's really important. That and it would bring something really, I think, it's a specialized experience that members who've actually served have. I don't have that experience, but I think some of the members of this committee do, and I think that's something that our report could. One of the reasons why I think our report could bring a tremendous amount of value. But even if it was just reinforcing what the Status of Women Committee has presented, I think that would do wonders on this issue, and that would make a meaningful difference on this issue and ultimately for survivors, which I'm so passionate about. So, so I wanted to share that. But I do want to say to Mr. Garrison, thank you again for your thoughtful response, and I thank you for sharing your personal experience. That takes courage, and I thank you. One of the things that I was speaking to previously that I wanted to come back to was what survivors have told us is one of the areas where survivors have told us there's need for improvement, that I think should be in a report by this committee. What I was speaking to previously was the testimony of Emily Tulloch, who's a survivor and an armed forces member who testified to the Status of Women Committee. And this is an example. What she was speaking to in her testimony is an example of the kind of issue that I think particularly those members on Defense Committee, but particularly those members who've served in the armed forces, would better understand. She was speaking to the military police and how they undertake investigations. Her recommendation was that the training for military police needs to be improved in the area of how they conduct interviews of sexual assault victims. And so I wanted to read a little bit of Ms. Tulloch's testimony around that particular issue. She says, I believe that an officer of the same sex of the victim should conduct the interview. In my situation, it wasn't offered that I could speak to a female officer until halfway through my interview when I started crying. And even then, the military police said they would have to reschedule for the next week because there was no female officer available. She goes on to say, in basic training, the leadership tries to ingrain the core values of the military in recruits. These values are duty, loyalty, integrity, and courage. These values are taught through PowerPoint and workbooks. However, these values are falling through the cracks. That is how we get this toxic culture that we have been dealing with for so long. It has been abundantly clear that military leadership has not been able to uphold the high ethical standards of integrity. If the leadership can't follow basic core values and set a good example, how are the majority of troops supposed to? I want to pause there for a moment because Ms. Tulloch speaking to, she says these values are duty, loyalty, integrity, and courage. These are the core values of the military, these are core values that the training of recruits emphasizes. And I think one of the things that this speaks to is that we have how much work has to be done in the area of culture change. I know Mr. Spengeman has spoken to this extensively. Mr. Bagnall has spoken to the issue of culture change extensively. But this is, Ms. Duluc's words are that these values are, quote, falling through the cracks. And then she says, this is how we get a toxic culture that we've been dealing with for so long. And so, we have here, I think Ms. Duluc is underlining something that I really think we need to drive home as a committee, not just culture change, but some of these specific concrete suggestions that are being made to us by survivors and by others who are familiar with culture change and who have testified before this committee. I think that would be, whether there's a little bit of overlap or not with the Status of Women report, the Standing Committee on Status of Women report, I think this would be something that is important to reinforce and drill down on and add additional suggestions or enter into additional detail.
D'ailleurs, Madame la Présidente, point d'ordre, j'aimerais...
Indeed, Madam Chair, I am just coming from the Status of Women, Standing Committee Status of Women. I'm just really sorry what's going on here. I just want to pick up on what's been said by Ms. Ellison to say that we've managed to put in a report, but now we have Mr. Robillard saying that we had asked in the report for the Jean report to be respected. We've been at this for 6 years, and here we are, and we would like to have this committee table a report.
Right. Thank you very much. All right. Anyone? I'm sorry. Carry on, Mr. Baker.
Thanks, Chair. So these are, I was speaking about Ms. Tulloch's testimony. She was speaking about culture change. She was speaking about how the core values of duty, loyalty, integrity, and courage are not being demonstrated by the leadership of the forces. And so she goes on to say, in basic training, we are shown this cartoon video that oversimplifies the concept of consent. In my view, this video is little more than a joke. It's all fun to watch, but the topic of sexual misconduct isn't fun. It should be uncomfortable enough to realize that this is a real issue that needs to be dealt with. In regard to Op Honor, I believe it has served its purpose, she goes on to say. It is time to end that course of action and start something else. Op Honor certainly got the conversation going and improved resources and education available to CAF members. But the leadership has been willfully ignorant of the fact that it has been seen as a joke for years. For many of us, Op Honor has aged like rotten milk. It just leaves a sour taste in your mouth.
All right. Suspended, disbandu. Thank you, everyone.